Hello, everybody, and welcome to our 5-minute Bible study series. We are talking about 1 Samuel chapter 8 in today's video. I wanted to go over some introductory information. You're going to have to forgive me for the time, but I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't mention this because this is a really significant chapter in the story of the Bible. And to understand the story of the Bible, we have to understand what's going on here. So in this chapter, the Israelites are going to ask for a king. And this is the first time that Israel is going to have a king. God is going to give them one. And this takes us into really a new period in Israelite history. And this is going to be the period that we follow for really the rest of the history that the Old Testament covers. For years, hundreds of years, the people of Israel had been in the land of Canaan that God gave them after Moses and Joshua led them there. They had been there under the supervision of God and of his representatives, the judges. But they grew discontent with that system. Even though God had kept all of his promises to them, they were like, we want something different. So they're going to ask for a king. And so what we need to watch for, well, just know that this is a continuation of the story. What happens to Israel? Do they follow God? And what we're going to watch for is, does having a king help this nation in any meaningful way? Are they going to be better, more obedient to God, more successful now that they have a king versus what we saw in the period of the judges where they were kind of on and off again with following God, being disobedient to God, and God was cursing them, then he was blessing them when they repented. Is the king going to stabilize anything? Is this going to turn out better in the end for them than when they just had God as their leader and his representatives? That's the question. So that's what we're going to get into really in the rest of the Old Testament, and we'll see how it goes. I won't spoil the story, even though I've spoiled it in previous videos. But let's talk about 1 Samuel chapter 8. When did these events happen? Well, our main character here is Samuel. He's the final, the final judge of Israel. He was born approximately 1100 BC. He died about 1012 BC, somewhere around there. Now, Israel's first king was appointed in approximately 1050 BC. Our characters section, we've got three different people. First of all, Samuel. We're pretty familiar with him at this point. He's a prophet of God. He grew up under the care of Eli, who was the last judge of Israel, and he judged Israel until his death. And then we've got Joel and Abijah, which we haven't been introduced to up until this point. These are Samuel's sons. They were actually appointed as judges in Israel, but their reign didn't last very long. Their term didn't last very long because they weren't good men. We'll talk about that in the outline section. We also have the elders of Israel. They're significant because in this chapter they come to Samuel and they request that a king be set over them. We know that Samuel judged Israel in a circuit. He went between three towns mainly, the town of Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah. Samuel met with the elders of Israel to deal with this request for a king at Ramah, which was actually his hometown. All right, so now for our important outline section. Verses 1 through 9, the Israelites ask for a king. When Samuel was old, he appointed his two sons as judges over Israel, but they were not good men. They took bribes, they were unjust. So the elders of Israel met with Samuel to discuss the direction of the nation. They requested that they get rid of the judge system and that Samuel appoint a king over them so that they could be like all the other nations who had a king. And I think that's an important point. They didn't want a king because God had, not kept his promises to bless them when they were faithful to him, or not kept the promises that he made to them back in Deuteronomy or in the law. They just wanted to be like everybody else. And that's typically not a good thing. So that's why they requested it. Now, this request displeased Samuel because it showed a lack of trust in God, that God was going to direct the nation faithfully. Samuel, though, went to God, he prayed, he asked for guidance, and the Lord also expressed his displeasure with the people. He told Samuel that the Israelites weren't rejecting him, weren't rejecting Samuel, but rather the Israelites were rejecting God as their king. They wanted an earthly king instead of a king in heaven. Nevertheless, though, interestingly, God told Samuel to honor their request, to give them a king, but first to warn them about the consequences of that decision. So that takes us to section number 2, verses 10 through 22, the consequences of a king. Samuel's warning to the people and their response to his warning. So Samuel went back to the elders of Israel and told them the words of the Lord. He says, if you appoint a king in Israel, That king is going to take your sons and make them his soldiers to fight his battles. That king would use their children as servants to plow his ground and to reap his fields. Their daughters would have to work in the kitchens of the king, cooking food for him. If a king was appointed in Israel, he would take the best of the people's harvests, their flocks, their servants, and keep them for himself and give them to his officers. Samuel prophesied that if the people did this, a day would come when they would cry out against the oppression of bad kings, who treated them poorly. But in that day, God was not going to listen to them and help them because he had warned them ahead of time. When Samuel finished this warning, the elders of Israel just completely disregarded it, and they reaffirmed their desire to have a king in Israel. They said, quote, "No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." And so that's where we leave off in chapter 8. The people have requested a king. They don't have one yet, but in the next chapter, we're going to go find a guy. And now finally for our application. No system of government will save a nation if that nation abandons God. Taking the history that we've already read about and the history that we will read about in the rest of the Old Testament, we find out that Israel was blessed as a nation during the period of the judges and during the period of the kings when they obeyed the commands of God. Israel failed as a nation both during the period of the judges and during the period of the kings when they disobeyed the commands of God. The success of a nation has more to do with God than it does the chosen system of government. And I think especially nowadays, that's really important to keep in mind.